Looks like IKEA meatballs and pickled fish will now be served in the NATO cafeteria because Sweden is the official newest member of NATO, putting the borders of the Western Aligned military bloc ever closer to Moscow. Here's the U.S. State Department's response.
We certainly welcome we certainly do welcome the vote in the Hungarian parliament today and look forward to it being finalized, and are ready to receive the instruments here in Washington and welcome Sweden as the 32nd member of NATO.
Per Politico, Sweden cleared the final hurdle to become the military alliance's 32nd member after Hungary, the last holdout among the countries, held a parliamentary vote to approve the move. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Sweden seemingly abandoned its position of neutrality toward NATO and applied to join. Hungary's more Kremlin-friendly government had been a holdout for over a year. Now, following Sweden and neighboring Finland's attempt to join NATO, Russia has adopted a more aggressive stance toward the countries. Moscow called Sweden, quote, a legitimate target for Russia's retaliatory measures last year. In response, the West has tightened controls on the Baltic Sea, complicating a vital transit route for the Russian Navy. That route has been complicated, but other efforts by the West to stymie Russia in response to its ongoing invasion of Ukraine seem to have stalled. A new Politico article notes that despite a slew of economic punishments, including sanctions, frozen assets, Mother Russia chugs along. As Politico puts it, 2 years on, Russia's economy has rebounded, its factories are humming, its oil and gas sales are relatively strong, and its people are at work in a system retrofitted to be all about the war. Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, appears firmly in charge of the Kremlin, despite hopes that Russia's elite would turn on him as the economic pressure grew.
In other Russia-related news, a series of investigations into the Nord Stream pipeline blast have seemingly come up with nothing. Denmark recently concluded its own investigation, claiming, quote, there is not sufficient grounds to pursue a criminal case in Denmark, and therefore the Copenhagen police has decided to conclude the criminal investigation of the explosions. Russia has said Denmark's findings are, quote, close to absurdity.
So we're getting to a position where NATO is growing, is expanding. These countries joining, obviously, Ukraine wants to be part of NATO as well. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what is this protective alliance for? Is it to have greater friction, tension with Russia, or is it to promote peace in the West? And if you think the goal is to keep the U.S. out of wars, while not abandoning people, of course, to be invaded, then I think you have to start wondering what we're doing here. Are we not making confrontation with Russia more likely by admitting all of its neighbors, even countries with which Russia had no conflict until this whole thing started up? Now, that's not to say that Russia should get whatever it wants or should be applauded for doing its illegal invasion of Ukraine, which has cost the lives of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. But you can still wonder if this is in the best interests of stability and peace.
I mean, I don't know that you can say that there's no risk for Sweden, given that Putin has said very recently that it was a legitimate military target. But I take your point. The whole point of this was a post kind of Cold War era defense treaty that was supposed to get smaller, not bigger, as normalization with Russia improved as opposed to devolved. And it does seem like a kind of escalation that is not going to lead anywhere good. Now, this is much less, I think, of an issue than the idea of including Ukraine in NATO, and that's where the eye has to be on the ball. Is this some indication of that's where this is going? Is Sweden's inclusion something on the path toward Ukraine being included, or a desire to continually provoke Russia in these kinds of ways? If so,
right. Including Ukraine without further negotiation with Russia would put us in an immediate place where we had to attack Russia, not just supply weapons, but supply commit ground forces. So if Ukraine wants to be part of NATO, wants the same protections of Sweden and other places, then we need negotiation with Russia such that they agree that the war is coming to an end and they're satisfied with, I guess, territorial gains, and Ukraine is willing to accept that. And then we can offer a protection to the rest of the country if Russia is satisfied with the negotiations and Zelensky is satisfied with the negotiations. That's something that just needs to happen before any talk of the entire country joining NATO, which would actually put us in a war. Are people like contemplating that? Is the Biden administration aware of what step that would actually involve taking?
The fact of the entire globe being forced to pay alms to one or another protection racket really does undermine the concept that we are all democracies that respect each other's borders. We had a disagreement earlier in the show about what I perceive to be the West's entitlement to decide the government of Palestine or whether or not it's allowed to have a government or function as an independent state. We have covered any number of instances of U.S.-backed coups, color revolutions, political interference, wars America has started with other nations in the name of democracy across the globe. And it is really interesting to see in real time. I mean, the choice to join a defensive group does really undermine the concept that these borders have any inherent integrity of their own outside of having the backing of a nuclear power willing to enforce it on your behalf, and what the implications are for broader democracy in any kind of true sense, as opposed to simply violence, political violence. It really is, I think, a telling moment in human history, to be honest.
Sure. I mean, yeah, and I mean, the situation that, I mean, Russia did not, recognize the boundaries of Ukraine, which are subject to some dispute, and boundaries have been drawn and redrawn a number of times.
It's a chicken and the egg kind of a situation, and this is where we get into so much trouble, where people like John Mearsheimer and Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal, who've been talking about this, get into so much trouble, which came first, the threat to include Ukraine in NATO, or the invasion to ostensibly stop the U.S. from spreading its sphere of influence, to include eastern Ukraine, which is this Russian-speaking, Russian-sympathetic, at least until the war, part of Ukraine. Who is the first that's infringing on people's sense of national boundaries, ethnic belonging, and the like, when you have what transpired in the years leading up to the 2022 invasion? Well,
and then and there's the issue of how egregious is each and every individual. Obviously, Russia's attempt to expand its sphere of influence by sending ground forces into a neighboring country and occupying it is a extremely aggressive move, unprecedented move. In fact, a lot of people didn't expect it to happen because it was so galling and extreme. So that was an extreme escalation that I think you could say that even if it was pushed to do that, or there were moves on the other side that made it more likely that they were going to do that, not each and every one of them was not as significant as that, but they did come first. So you get it's like a chicken and egg problem, but what if the chicken part of it is really more big and consequential, but the egg part came first, and you sort these things out, because the boundaries of countries do change over time, and then you get into, well, who actually has the rights, the country, or to the extent we, I think, believe that countries have rights or have borders or can defend themselves, what we're really talking about is the people who comprise them should be able to defend themselves. But what if part of the country, a group of people, want to be part of a different country or want to be part of their own country? It reaches a point where there's enough of those people, they're so overwhelming that they do change hands. Now, of course, we don't generally recognize that that's okay. Like if I want to start my own country within the United States, everybody would laugh at me, obviously. But
there's succession movements.
They happen, and sometimes they're successful. Yeah. So we will have more Rising right after this.